Hey everybody, how's it going? In this video, we're going to learn how to prepare for a Python interview and 10 things that you should know before going into this interview. So I'm going to go over some different advice and we'll also look at some code examples to get you ready. So one thing before I get started is that a lot of what I'm going to say here applies to entry-level Python positions. So if you're applying for a senior level position, then likely that's going to require you to know all of the items in this list, but then you'll also need to know some more advanced topics as well. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing is that you should know how to write code on a whiteboard or a piece of paper. Now this isn't just specific to Python. This goes for any programming language that you're going to have an interview with, because a lot of companies won't have a computer set up for your interview. So you're likely going to be in a room with either a notebook or a whiteboard, and live coding might not even come up in your interview, but if it does, then you need to be ready to do that without a computer. So if you've never done this before, then you'd actually be surprised at how hard it is to not use a computer. So you might want to go ahead and start doing all of your practice problems that you're preparing for your interview. Do them all on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper, and then go back and check all of those answers on a computer to make sure that you got all the syntax correct and everything like that. Okay, so moving on to number 2. Know the basic control flow within Python. So by control flow, I mean know how to use for loops, while loops, if and else statements, and things like that. So I have a code example here that we can take a look at. So I know a lot of this looks extremely basic, but like I said before, you're not going to have a computer, so you want to know how to write these things out without thinking about it. You're not going to have any auto completion or anything like that. So know how to write down a for loop and loop through a certain amount of numbers. So if I run this code here, it just loops through these numbers. You want to know how to use while loops, because those could come up in an interview as well. And then you also want to know how to use your if and else statements, and also your elif statements here. Now I know these three things, for loops, while loops, and these if statements, I know it seems completely basic, but you'd be surprised at how many people freeze up on these very basic questions whenever they are new to the interview process. So just be sure that you can write them down all by hand and that you know them inside and out, and exactly how the program is going to flow through all of these conditionals. Okay, so number 3. Be able to discuss how you've used Python in the past. So your interviewer is likely going to ask you about past projects and you just don't want to draw a blank. So if you've never used Python professionally and you're applying for an entry-level position, then be sure to write a basic project before the interview so that you can have some example of something that you've written in your free time. And also, whatever you choose to write, try to make it something that's interesting and that'll be interesting to your interviewer. Just don't tell them how you've solved a bunch of sample interview problems like FizzBuzz and Fibonacci sequences and things like that. So for example, if you need a couple of ideas for some cool programs that you could write, maybe you want to play around with web scraping and make a script that pulls weather information each day. You can use the Beautiful Soup module for that. Or you could write a program that performs system tasks. So you could write a program that cleans up folders on your computer or moves files around, displays CPU and memory, or something along those lines. So for example, I've written a really small program here that just uses the OS module and the glob module, goes into this directory here. If I run this code, it just goes into my demo directory here and prints out all of the JPEG images. So, something like this, just learn how to write a file like this, and then whenever your interviewer asks you the question, you can say something interesting like, well, once I did write a program that looked through my file system and found all these images and moved them to a specific location, or something like that. So those are just a couple of examples and ideas to get you started, but I'm sure that you can think of some really cool ideas on your own after thinking about it for a few minutes. Okay, so number 4, know how to solve common interview problems and questions. So a little bit ago, I mentioned FizzBuzz and Fibonacci sequences and things like that. Those are some common questions that interviewers like to ask. Now, there's been a lot of debate around that type of interview process on online forums. A lot of people say that those type of problems aren't a good indicator of programming skill, and that interviewers should ask better problems that more reflect real-world situations. But even though there's a lot of debate whether interviewers should ask those questions, a lot of interviewers do ask those questions. So whether or not you think that they should or shouldn't is a totally different discussion, but you should be prepared to at least answer those questions. And really, it doesn't take a long time to learn how to solve a lot of these common problems. So, like for example, if you don't know what FizzBuzz is, basically it is your interviewer will ask you to loop through a range of numbers, and if the number is divisible by 3, then print out fizz. If it's divisible by 5, print out buzz. If it's divisible by both, then print out FizzBuzz. And this is a solution to the problem here. If I print this out, you can see that it loops through, and every one that's divisible by 3, it prints out fizz and buzz, and if it's divisible by both, then it prints out FizzBuzz. So usually these kind of questions are meant to weed out people who don't understand the basic concepts of a computer language. So for example, here you have to know how to use for loops and iterate over a range of numbers. You have to know the modulo operator and some things like that. And it's the same thing with the Fibonacci sequence. That's another question that a lot of interviewers like to ask. So the Fibonacci sequence, if you don't know what that is, basically you print out a number, and each number that you print out is the previous 2 numbers added together. So here, let me just print out this example. It'll be easier to show. So you can see I printed out these numbers here. So 0 and 1, if you add those together, it equals 1. If you add 1 and 1, it equals 2. If you add 1 and 2, it equals 3, and it keeps going and keeps going. So you can do this in, let's see, this is 4 lines of Python code here. So, like I said, a lot of people don't like these questions because they're not the best indicator of programming ability, but they do like to ask these questions, and they're so short that it really wouldn't hurt you to learn how to solve these problems. And not only should you learn how to solve them, just don't memorize the solutions to these, because it'll be obvious that you're just kind of regurgitating what you've memorized. You really want to understand what's going on. So for example, in this Fibonacci sequence, this is kind of a unique assignment here. A comma B equals 0 comma 1. You want to understand what's going on there. You want to understand what's going on in this assignment here. That looks a little bit more complicated. So look this up online, understand what's going on, and be prepared for these type of questions. And these 2 questions aren't the only 2 common questions that get asked in interviews. So after you understand these 2 questions, get on Google and just Google Python interview questions and take a look at the first few results, because you might even run into a recruiter or an interviewer who has taken the questions straight from the first results of the Google search. So then you'd be prepared for those questions. So it's good practice just to go through those and be ready for some of the basic stuff that people might throw at you. Okay, so moving on here, number 5, know basic Python data types and when to use them. So these basic data types include strings and lists and tuples and dictionaries and sets. Not only should you understand how they differ from each other and when you should use one over the other, but also know how to iterate over each one. So for example here, we just have a list here that we can iterate over. We have a tuple here that we can iterate over in the same way. The dictionary is kind of unique, so whenever we iterate over the dictionary here, a dictionary is key value pairs. So we want to look at the key and value in all of the dictionary's items and then print those out. So that's something that you'll probably get asked and you want to know how to solve. And also sets. If you don't know what a set is, pretty much it's a list with no repeated values. And if we loop through this list here and print this out, you can see that all of these are unique values, even though that there are duplicates that are added to this set. So whenever I say that you want to know when to use different data types over another, like one question, for example, that you might get asked is, why would you use a tuple instead of a list? And that's something that you want to know the answer to. So I'm not going to go into that detail here, but I will put some links into the description below that kind of answer some of these questions for you. And also for some bonus points in a question like this, if you can understand the underlying data structures and functionality of how these data types work, then that would be great. So that's more computer science related. But for example, you should be able to talk about a dictionary being a hash table and exactly what that means. So yeah, like I said, I'm not going to go into much depth about that topic here, but you should look up the underlying data structures involved with these data types and know their advantages, know their weaknesses, know how data gets accessed within these data types, and also know when to properly use each data type. Okay, so moving on here to number 6, know how to use list comprehensions. Now this is a little bit more advanced, but this is the kind of information that will help you stick out amongst other candidates. So for example, I have a file here of list comprehensions. Now again, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I have an entire video on list comprehensions, dictionary comprehensions, and set comprehensions. So if you want more detail about that, then I'll put that I'll put that link in the description below. But basically, it's a more clean and readable way to create these lists. So for example, in this, so say you have a sample problem where your interviewer gives you a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then he says, okay, just create a list that gives me the square of each number in that list. So off the top of your head, you might want to write a for loop that goes through each item and then squares the item and returns a result and all that. But I think your interviewer will be really impressed if you just know how to do this short little one-liner here. And list comprehensions are used in real-world scenarios all the time. So not only is it going to help you in your interview, but it's going to help you actually on the job. So here we just are creating a list that is the square of the number for each number in the list. So if we print that out, you can see that we returned a list here with the squares of all of those numbers. Okay, so let's move on to number 7 here. Know how to use generators. So you're going to want to know when you want to use generators and also the benefits that you receive from using generators. So if I go back to the common problem example here with the FizzBuzz and the Fibonacci sequence, I actually have a Fibonacci sequence here that I've written using generators instead. So if they do ask you a question like this and you used generators instead, then that'll be big bonus points for your interviewer. So in this example, it's almost exactly like the Fibonacci sequence that we went over before, except now we have a function here which yields, and yield is the key word that lets you know that it's a generator. So it yields your result, and then we can loop through the generator and print out each item. So if we run through, then we can see that it still works just like it worked before, but now we're using generators instead, which have more advantages over returning a list. But there are times in when you wouldn't want to use generators, so you do want to do your research and figure out when you really do get those advantages from generators and when they may not be the best option for you at the time. Also, know generator alternatives to certain Python version 2 functions. So for example here, you can see that we have an X range here. So it's nice to know that this is that X range behaves more like a generator than what range does. So X range yields one result at a time, and range puts the entire range of numbers into memory at once. That's the same thing with, if I go back to the data types example here, this dictionary example here, you can see that we are using iter items instead of items, because iter items gives us one result back at a time rather than putting all of the items into memory. So be sure to look up generators, understand what they are, when you would want to use them, and also some of these alternatives where you can use generators in place of these older Python 2 functions. Okay, so moving on here, number 8, know the basics of OOP, or object-oriented programming. So to prepare for the basics of object-oriented programming for your interview, what I would do is I would just have a sample file or program and write these from scratch over and over and over until it just feels natural. So in your head, you're going to want to know the general template for a class. And so you have to remember, again, that you're not going to be using a computer. So this is one of the main things that will trip people up if they are just writing stuff on the whiteboard, because it's so easy on your computer just to hit control space or something and have it pop up and give you the entire init function and fill it all in for you. But to do that from scratch can be a challenge. So I would just write these files over and over and over until you just know how to write down the class, what it inherits from. Remember to put in your init functions and self, and then the arguments, and then initialize all of those parameters. Also, you may be asked to explain what certain things mean. For example, self, you might be asked to explain what self means and what it means to make an instance of a class. So for example, I would also make instances of your classes, and here's an example where we are taking a person class and giving them a name. Then we have a method called reveal identity that just prints out their name. So I have an instance of that class down here. If I run that, you can see that it just prints out my name is Corey when it runs this reveal identity function. And we also have a superhero class that inherits from person, so you want to know how to inherit from classes. Also, you want to know how to initialize based off of that base class, and then how to override methods. So for example, here we are calling our base classes reveal identity, and then we're adding in some additional functionality here. So if I comment out this Corey variable and uncomment this Wade variable and then run this, you can see that it prints out his name and then his superhero name. So there's a little extra functionality there. So like I said, I would just have a sample file here of a base class, a class that inherits from that base class, and then instances of both of those, and just write those over and over and over until you feel really comfortable with writing out those templates from scratch, and being able to do that without a computer. Okay, so let's move on here to number 9. So number 9, have Python related questions ready to ask your interviewer. So it's good to have these questions prepared, because if you feel strong in a certain area of Python, then this will give you a chance to bring up those areas that you're strong in if they don't come up in the interview. So for example, let's say that you've been really studying the differences between Python 2 and Python 3 and how to port Python 2 applications over to Python 3. If it doesn't come up in the interview, at the end they're going to ask you if you have any questions. So just bring up questions like, hey, do you guys use Python 2 or Python 3? And also you want to be prepared for follow-up questions to your questions. So don't ask a question that you're not prepared to answer follow-up questions about, because if you ask, are you using Python 2 or Python 3, then your interviewer may ask you, oh, well, that's a good question. We just moved over to Python 3, or we're thinking about moving over to Python 3. What would you recommend and why? Also, can you tell me some of the differences between those versions and things like that? So a couple of other examples of this. Maybe you've been practicing working with databases in Python. You could ask them what they're using to communicate with their databases. Ask them if they're using SQL Alchemy. If you've been practicing unit testing with Python and it didn't come up in the interview, then you could ask them if they're currently testing their Python code base and what testing modules that they're using. So just questions like that. It'll let you bring up the areas that you're most strong in, and then they can ask you follow-up questions about that, so that you can really end on a strong note. Okay, and the last bit of advice here that I have isn't really related to Python, but you're also going to want to know the basics of other technologies when you go into your interview. So in today's tech industry, I mean, there's tons of technologies that programmers use on a daily basis. And you're going to want to know some of these technologies and not just Python. So for example, it'll be a huge benefit to learn version control, like something like Git. It'll be nice to know how to navigate through the command line and basic Linux commands, understand how databases work, and how to write some basic SQL code. Now, I know that sounds like a lot and it can sound overwhelming, but you don't need to be an expert in these other technologies. A lot of people get caught up on that and they feel like they need to know everything about everything. But just at least know what these other technologies are and know the basics of some of those technologies. Some people like to describe this as a T-shaped skill set, and I'll provide a link to that in the description below. But basically, a T-shaped skill set means that you're advanced in a certain topic, but also that you have exposure to several other technologies. So I'd really suggest before your job interview to go back to the job description and see what other technologies they list in that description besides Python, and be sure that you at least know something about everything that's on that list. And so that about does it for the 10 things for preparing for a Python interview. That's all the advice that I had. Now, I do want to say that this is my own advice, and I'm sure that a lot of other people probably disagree with this or have other methods, and that's okay. I mean, the best methods for preparing for interviews and the interview process in general, it's always been constantly evolving and mutating. What's the norm today for the interview process might be frowned upon the next day. For example, Google used to ask these brain teasers that people never really liked. Like, for example, they might ask how many ping pong balls that you could fit into a 747 jet, and to talk through your thought process as you solve that problem. Now, I believe that they've recently stopped doing these brain teasers and they've instead started focusing on data structures and algorithms. But really the point is that the interview process, it changes over time. Different people have different advice for how to prepare for these interviews. So by all means, don't use this video as your single resource to prepare for your Python interview. I strongly believe that you should feel comfortable with everything in this list, but after you've got all this stuff down, then search through other resources online to prepare for that interview. So that about does it for this video. I hope it was useful for you guys. If you have any questions, just ask in the comment section below. Be sure to subscribe for future videos. Thank you guys for watching, and good luck on your job interview.